But first, let's answer this question. Why did the dog cross the road twice? No, because he was a dirty double crosser. That would be good. That would be good. In fact, I can see my kids writing it that way. But this one was trying to fetch a boomerang. Makes sense, doesn't it? More logical, not necessarily all that funny. All right, how about this one? What movie did the pirate watch?
Armageddon.
It was rated R. There you go. There's R2. You guys want one more? Not too excited about that. Let's do one more. I didn't get a whole lot of laughter, so. What did the pencil say? What did the pen say to the pencil? Pretty close. So, what's your point? All right, should we get to actual science? You guys ready for that?
Let's go outside.
Let's go outside. Let's have a lecture outside. Where it's windy as all get out. All right. So this is where we're picking up. We're going to be looking at the division of the autonomic nervous system. And when we take a peek at this, we can see that it's divided up into two major categories, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches. So we have our sympathetic nervous system. It's responsible for things like fight or fright. So if you get woken up in the middle of the night by a fire alarm and your heart starts to race, this is a sympathetic response. Okay? This is going to increase things like heart rate. It's going to increase breathing or respirations. It increases blood pressure. It increases blood glucose levels. Why does it increase blood glucose levels? So you have more energy available to run away, for example. It also increases the perfusion to skeletal muscle, because the skeletal muscle is going to need to be active. Things that it decreases that go in that blank are it decreases or shunts blood away from the digestive tract. It decreases blood perfusion to the skin. You shunt blood away from the skin in the GI tract to the exercising muscle so that you use it there where it's more needed at that moment in time. Okay? Just the polar opposite is the parasympathetic response. This is a calming type of activity, like feeding, okay, resting, digesting a meal. This is going to reduce energy expenditures. It's going to shunt blood away from muscle and towards the GI tract. It's going to slow down respirations and slow down heart rate. This is kind of the food coma phenomenon. That's your parasympathetic response kicking in, telling you to calm down, close your eyes. Right? What if I lectured like that right after the... I had a professor like that in college, and it was like half the class was right out. So it reduces energy expenditures. It decreases heart rate. It decreases respiration. It increases or supervises is a better word. It supervises digestion and waste elimination. Parasympathetic. Okay. Yes.
I mean this in a serious matter, but when you are breathing, does your heart rate go up and gas?
So the breathing activity is a good question, okay? But the breathing activity doesn't happen while you're running, if you think about the animal kingdom. So it's an interesting question. A lot of times we get stinkers, but if you really think about breathing, this is a slow down, rest, digest, you lay down, okay, the animal kingdom. Now, breeding can get exciting. You can watch it on Channel 8, you know, in the animal kingdom, and it's like, whoa, animal porn, right? It's pretty nuts, right? So, yeah, I made the Snickers happen, I guess, there. But it's a good question. So we do link this into a parasympathetic response because typically the organism is slowing down in order to have that activity take place. Okay? The other thing that you'll realize, for example, this is all seriousness. If you look at drug activities, okay, drug activities that affect erectile dysfunction. Okay, so erectile dysfunction, a erection in the male is blood flow increasing to the penis. And it does that by vasodilating that organ, vasculature, on a parasympathetic response. Okay? So an erection in the mammalian kingdom for males is a parasympathetic response. Now, the interest of the activity triggers increases in heart rate, but in order for breeding to take place, the erection has to happen in the animal kingdom. Okay, so that's where you link those two. So if you look at the activities of drugs that are purposeful towards curbing the negative effects of erectile dysfunction, like Cialis or Viagra, they are vasodilators in a parasympathetic response to the vasculature that perfuses the penis. Okay? Since you asked. All right. Both of these are active simultaneously. So most of the time we have dual activity happening. And you have both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic innervation taking place. And you have what we call a basal tone or an autonomic tone. Now there are examples that we'll look at today of organs that only have single innervation. Not dual innervation, meaning they don't have both parasympathetic and sympathetic. But if they do have parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation, you have some basal amount of activity that's happening. It's kind of like just making sure that that electrical connection is still working. Okay, I don't know, those of you in the computer realm, there's a way to have one computer talk to another. Like if you have a computer issue over a network, and you'll ping a computer. Have you ever heard that terminology? So you send a signal to the computer to see if it answers back. Okay, and that's very similar to what happens with nerves. If you don't use it, you lose it phenomenon. So even if you're relaxed, you'll have some low level of sympathetic tone because you want to make sure that that neuron still is operational for when it needs to be used. Okay? If we take a peek at the sympathetic nervous system specifically, we also refer to this as the thoracolumbar division. And the reason we call it the thoracolumbar division is because the nerves come off this particular area. And the adrenal glands are a big component of the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal glands sit above the kidneys. They're really actually a modified sympathetic ganglion. Remember, a ganglion, what is the definition of a ganglion? Yeah, like a network or a collection of cell bodies, nerve cell bodies. Ganglion. So this is a collection of cell bodies, and it functions to secrete two main actives. The first one we refer to as epinephrine, and the second one we refer to as norepinephrine, abbreviated EPI, epi, and NE, norepinephrine. Now another common term for epinephrine, does anybody know? Adrenaline. And the other common term for norepinephrine is called what? Noradrenaline. So adrenaline and noradrenaline are sympathetic actives that are released by the sympathetic nervous system. So adrenaline, this adrenaline response, and when you get excited about something, that adrenaline is coming from the adrenal medulla. Okay, so here's a picture of what that looks like, a drawing. And you can kind of appreciate the components of the adrenal medulla. There's the medulla, which is in the middle, and then there's the adrenal cortex, which is the surrounding structure. And these nerves, when they're stimulated by the sympathetic preganglionic neuron, they actually release the epinephrine and the norepinephrine into the circulation. And that circulates around in a hormonal type of response. You'll learn about more next semester in 202 when you talk about endocrinology. But when we look at epinephrine and norepinephrine next semester, hopefully you'll remember that it comes and is manufactured by the adrenal medulla. If it goes into the circulation, then it takes a little time for it to actually see the heart. Not a lot of time, but a couple of heartbeats have to happen before adrenaline shows up. So you can probably recall if you got woke up in the middle of the night with a fire alarm, or maybe it's every morning with your alarm clock, okay? It's the same, shocking sound. And you pop out of bed, you're startled, and then like a couple of seconds later, you can feel your heart rate just start pounding. Because that epinephrine takes a little time to get to the heart via the circulation, where it has its activity. Now the parasympathetic nervous system, this one's called the craniosacral. The craniosacral because the nerves really come out at the level of the cranium and then way down here at the level of the sacral outflow. So if we back up 2 slides, you can see the thoracolumbar division, otherwise known as sympathetic. These nerves are coming out at the level of the thorax and the lumbar region down here. Okay, so we have craniosacral and thoracolumbar. So our craniosacral, they leave the brainstem via cranial nerves. And this is what you study in lab. And so we'll highlight a couple here. Like for example, cranial nerve number 3. Which one is that? Oculomotor nerve. The facial nerve is cranial nerve what? You guys remember? 7. Okay. Glossopharyngeal or glossopharyngeal. 9. And then the vagus nerve. What's the vagus nerve? 10. Cranial nerve 10. So let's take a peek at the vagus nerve. You can see oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, or glossopharyngeal, and then the vagus nerve. And you can see, obviously, the oculomotor innervating the eye, facial nerve going into various locations in the face, salivary glands, and as well as the glossopharyngeal or pharyngeal. And then cranial nerve 10 has a huge distribution. Look at all the places that cranial nerve 10 goes to. Okay? So the activity of cranial nerve 10, or the vagus nerve, has activity on the heart, lungs, all of digestion. And then down at the lower end, in our sacral region, remember this is craniosacral, parasympathetic nervous system, you can see that this pelvic splanchnic nerve innervates into the hypogastric plexus, and this actually perfuses the lower abdomen. Okay, and so you can see actually here what I was talking about with respect to innervation to the penis for erection. It's actually parasympathetic outflow. Okay. All right, so we have our parasympathetic nervous system. We have our sympathetic nervous system. We actually really have a third type. It's considered a subtype, but it's a lot of times talked about all on its own. And this is the enteric nervous system. Now, this is a subdivision of this autonomic nervous system, and it is influenced by sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. But this thing can operate independently. And its role is to directly control the gastrointestinal system, the GI system. So the GI system has this plexus, this nerve plexus, that is about 100 million neurons within the wall of the digestive tract. And it will control smooth muscle contraction of the digestive tract for segmentation and peristaltic movement. Now, what that means is segmentation is any motion that causes churning, like a physical churning so you can break up food mechanically. Or peristalsis motion is kind of like squeezing the end of the toothpaste, right? Where you squeeze the end and then the toothpaste moves forward. You squeeze here and it moves forward again. So peristalsis would be contraction behind the bolus of chyme, which is digestive food. And so it propels it forward. So the enteric nervous system, very independent, although can be controlled or under the influence of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Now, if we take a look at the organization or the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system, we see that outside of the spinal cord cleft, you have these collection of cell bodies, right? You've got these ganglion. You see these little bulges that take place. And we've got these patterns, these nice organized patterns that highlight three main tracks or pathways that I want you to focus on. And they're shown right here. Spinal nerve, the sympathetic nerve, and the splanchnic nerve. And the goal here is to actually send out from this system, the sympathetic nervous system, via three main routes, distribution to the entire body, or widespread effect. So let's take a look at how this works. So if we highlight the three, here's our sympathetic nerve up here. Here's our spinal nerve, which is the spinal nerve first. Here's our spinal nerve. Then our sympathetic nerve. And then over here is our splanchnic nerve. And these little pink or peach-colored boxes identify the different regions that signals go to in the body based upon using that pathway. Okay, so for example, if we look at the sympathetic nerve, this is going to send things basically in an upwards fashion to the iris, the salivary glands, lungs, heart, thoracic blood vessels. If we look at the next one, the spinal nerve, this one actually comes out towards sweat glands, the skin, blood vessels, and skeletal muscles. And then if we come down this direction, you can see the splanchnic nerve gets you into the areas of the belly, right? And into sort of the hypothoracic region, just below the thorax. The liver, the spleen, the adrenal glands, the stomach, the intestines, kidneys, reproductive organs. So these are the three main tracks that I want you to be familiar with. Would it be wise to know which one of these goes into which region? Yes, I do want you to understand that. So if I asked a question about, what is the splanchnic nerve innervate, you would know all of these things is what it innervates, for example. Okay? Yes?
Do you want us to know if it comes from the lateral horn as well as the dorsal horn?
Oh, so I'm not as worried about that. I'm not as worried about that as much. I mean, for the most part, if you're sending a motor output signal, you're going to be coming out of the ventral aspect, okay, or the anterior horn. Okay? So that's important to know. For the previous lecture, we're talking about just the difference between sensory and motor. I do want you to be able to discriminate. If I asked a question about sensory information, which horn does it go in? And if it's motor, which horn does it come out? Okay, so sensory is coming in the dorsal or the posterior aspect, and motor is coming out the ventral or the anterior aspect. Now, if we look at further organizational features of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, we're going to see the parasympathetic nervous system is characterized by this long presynaptic axon. And I'm going to show you some pictures later. And I'm going to have you do some drawings tonight or over the weekend. Because I want you to practice what these pathways look like. They will help you solidify this information. I've discovered when I started having students draw these pathways, it became a lot more clear. Otherwise, students were getting really confused on how to discriminate between a parasympathetic pathway and a sympathetic pathway architecturally. Okay, so this one is a long presynaptic axon. So if you didn't do the reading, this is kind of confusing so far. If you did the reading, you're like, oh, I know exactly what he's talking about. Well, we're going to get to some pictures here in a moment. It travels to a terminal cell body collection, or a ganglia, and it has selective stimulation. Now, here's an example of some pictures that we're going to start with. I want you to para, and I want you to start talking about the differences that you see between the top pathway, which we call a somatic efferent innervation, and the bottom pathway, which is an autonomic efferent innervation. I meant like right now. Not on Easter, like today. Okay, so question or?
Is the bottom picture parasympathetic or sympathetic pathway?
Oh, is the bottom picture? We're not quite there yet, so hold off on that question. Let's first start with comparing and contrasting. So I just want you guys to tell me what are some differences. What do you see up top? Just shout some things out. It's myelinated all the way.
Continuous.
Okay. It's contiguous, or continuous rather. There's no break in between. Right? The bottom one has sort of this autonomic ganglion right here with the synapse. How do I know there's a synapse? Because I have a neurotransmitter being released. What else? What are some other observations before we get into saying what is what? One half, okay, so acetylcholine. So we have acetylcholine here, there's acetylcholine here, but this one has an option to use acetylcholine or norepinephrine, right? Okay, what else? What else do you see? Okay, top is somatic, and the bottom is autonomic. What does that mean? What's that? More voluntary activities versus involuntary activities. So should answer your question over here. So we're not really into parasympathetic or sympathetic quite yet. Okay, do you see different target tissues here? Okay, so there's some different target tissues. Now these are motor outputs, right? They're both motor outputs. Do you see that? Okay. So if I wanted to ask this question a different way, these are examples of reflex arcs. Those two figures. So one of them is a somatic reflex arc. That's the top one. One of them is an autonomic reflex arc. That's the bottom one. Right? So when we look at the architecture of neuronal pathways, before we get into parasympathetic and sympathetic, we look at just reflex arcs that are used throughout the body, somatic versus visceral. The answer to this question is the previous slide in a drawing format. You with me? So the top one is a somatic reflex arc. It's just not showing you the sensory afferent input that comes in to go back to the skeletal muscle. But this is a reflex arc, and what are some examples that we used in the last lecture to describe it? At the level of muscle, there were two. One sounds like muscle indole. Muscle spindle, very good. You guys are brilliant. And then the other one is like Golgi tendon, sounds like. Golgi tendon. You guys are sharp as a tack. Okay, so two examples we talked about last time. Is this making a little more sense? Where this fits in? What are some two autonomic ones that we looked at?
Heart rate.
We looked at, well, it was controlling blood pressure, but the rate of contraction of the heart to modify blood pressure, agreed. And the other one? Urination, okay? Peeing, or the more street term, mituration reflex. Yeah, use that one on the street. Okay? So, these reflex arcs are characterized architecturally very differently. A third way to say the same information. Okay? Picture a question and then a table. I hopefully have covered the right and left brain people in the audience with 3 individual slides over really the same information. You guys with me? So if you look at comparing and contrasting for 15.1, table 15.1, somatic uses skeletal muscle as the effector. Usually it's voluntary control. There's a nerve fiber, one nerve fiber that goes from the central nervous system to the effector organ with no ganglia present. Let's just double check that. Agreed. There's no ganglia in between. Okay? Uses acetylcholine exclusively. It's always excitatory. If you cut the nerve, you get what we call flaccid paralysis. Flaccid meaning it cannot contract. Paralysis meaning that there's no more nerve input. If we contrast that, compare it to, or say versus on the exam, for example, we would be talking about this bottom picture, or we would be talking about this question here, which is a visceral reflex arc, otherwise known as autonomic. And we would say that it could go to gland, smooth muscle, or cardiac muscle. This is our mituration type of reflex. Our baroreceptor reflex was what that was called in that video last time we were together. It's usually involuntary. You have 2 nerves from the central nervous system. There's a synapse in between. Let's just double check that. Yes, I agree. There's the synapse in between. Okay? It could be excitatory or inhibitory. And if you cut the nerve, you get what we call denervation hypersensitivity. So it becomes overly sensitized with a nerve cutting. Okay? That wraps up that lecture. Questions? Would it be particular?